evidence that emerges from this period that speaks to race relations in the United States, maybe especially contemporary race relations in the United States. And the last 50, 60 years of American society, the debates about where black urban poverty, what caused it, and then secondarily, what were the roots of black inequality in America in the 20th century. For many decades, the 1940s, 50s, 60s, the standard response was, these things are legacies of slavery. Everything bad is a legacy of slavery. One of the revisionist historiographical interpretations, historiography changes because every generation looks at history differently. They ask different questions. They look at different evidence. They come up with different interpretations. And the causes of black urban poverty in the late 20th century. As we'll see, slavery ends, and there's a chance for starting afresh, a clean slate in some respects. And what does instead happen is a pattern of inequality in terms of economic resources and economic power and political power. A pattern of racial discrimination that's completely tolerated and appears in the law even. The causes of black inequality, urban poverty in the 20th century, maybe they're not so much the cause of the institution of slavery and its legacies, as though one is in a permanent condition because one was once a slave. These are the results of enduring, long-term institutions of equality in the United States after slavery was over. When you look at African-American migrants to the north and immigrants in the 19th and early 20th century, really there's not a lot of difference between them from an objective standpoint. When you look at them as participants in the economy, members of the society, immigrants are really poor, African-Americans are really poor, not particularly well educated, although the fact of the matter is that African-American literacy after slavery is really high. One of the first things that emancipated African Americans do is they rush to get educated. They have a faith in American upper mobility. They get educated, they'll be all right. And a lot of immigrants are not particularly educated. African Americans have a higher literacy rate than a lot of immigrants. Immigrants are not all the same. Some of them came from places that had a lot of city development and they had experience with urban life before they came to America. It was an advantage to them. They knew how cities operated. They knew how a labor market operates. And many immigrants were, in fact, really poor peasants. Maybe passed through cities on the way north, and many of them were really literally peasants in the South. They had no education. They were working the land either as very small farmers or sharecroppers or tenant farmers or agricultural labor. But they're no less equipped to deal with urban life than immigrants from really backward places in Europe or in Asia. When you look at the comparability of who those people were, immigrants and African Americans, and you look at the subsequent history of immigrants who get on the American mobility ladder, and African Americans who experience generations of inequality and urban poverty, starting to look like slavery is not of itself the long-term effect of the situation that African Americans are forced into in the 20th century. And increasingly it's starting to look like the cause of this is what happens after slavery. In many respects is just as bad. In some it's even worse because you get equality, but it's not real equality. So the crushed hope. Historiographically, that's a big question. Is this post-slavery period really the beginning of the cause of serious and lingering racial inequality, black urban poverty in the United States? Left off last time talking about slavery and the Civil War and the Southern economy. My argument was that things changed in the 1830s because suddenly you have the moral cause of abolitionism, the Second Great Awakening. When you say slavery, you say cotton. You say cotton, you say slavery. These two things are inextricably linked in the 19th century economy. And thirdly, it was a settled question, but then it kept getting unsettled. Once that war is touched off, that war is about slavery, but that are really unionists. They really want to keep the union together. So they're, on the slavery issue, that's not their issue, but they're supporting the union, and they think secession is treason. In the beginning of the American Civil War, there's a lot of dancing around the issue of slavery because Lincoln and the Republican Party, they don't want to make the war look like it's about slavery because politically they want to keep the loyalty of the border states and as well Northern Democrats who are unionists but they're not anti-slavery. If they suddenly seceded, it would be a very different war. And we're talking about Delaware, Maryland, and secondly, for diplomatic reasons, it's important to try to make this a moral cause that it secretly was all along with respect to the English, supporting the Confederacy, in effect, anti-slavery sentiment in Great Britain. There's a concern in the Lincoln administration that it's time to reveal the moral aspects of this cause, and by 1863, in terms of not money but blood in the North, are high enough in order to continue to justify this war that otherwise could have been compromised, is really to embrace the fact that this really is the moral cause of his time. It's not a war to keep the Union together or for states' rights or against states' rights or any of these things. Who's going to get killed for states' rights? For one's immortal soul to fight the sin of slavery. But it's still, in some respects, an ambivalent war in some way. We're looking at emancipation, but we're looking at emancipation that in the same way it was uncompensated to the slaveholder when they talked about it. Now, it's going to be emancipation, but it's not going to come with compensation. They're going to get their freedom. They're not going to get anything else. Now, one of the aspects of this war that also is especially interesting in terms of one becomes an American. The way to become an American is you shed blood to defend America. You're looking at immigrant groups in the 20th century, how they belong in America even though they may be considered racially inferior. When they make claims about that, they usually go back and say, A, we were here at the beginning, and B, they say we fought in such and such war. All these groups have their American Revolutionary War hero. One of the things that, of course, happens in the American Civil War is that the Union Army starts to recruit African Americans. African Americans rush to join, and for Lincoln, this is like a secret weapon, and white Southerners, their horror, black troops armed and rising up against them. But they equip themselves they don't buckle, they don't break, they fight down to the last drop of their blood. In a way, this becomes a baptism of African American citizenship. It's very important in the narrative of freedom and inclusion in the idea of citizenship. The Republican Party does, in fact, take up a series of amendments to the United States Constitution that are supposed to, and they're really radical amendments, considering where things were 5 or 10 years earlier. The 14th Amendment, which, when you read it, it's hard to figure out really what it appertains to, but it becomes one of the most important amendments in the United States Constitution, the Civil Rights Amendment, where it bestows civil rights upon the emancipated. Just because you're not a slave doesn't mean you're a citizen. And the 14th Amendment actually gives citizenship rights to the emancipated. They do this, they enact this, the amendments are passed. This is a big deal, because these amendments will be a powerful tool from 1865 to 1876, a period called Reconstruction, tries to, and succeeds to a great extent, in undoing the Civil War. You don't have the moral fervor of William Lloyd Garrison. There's just an exhaustion. White Northerners want to get back to business as usual. They want to take advantage of post-war economic opportunity. They don't want the distraction of this endless losing moral cause. They're interested in large-scale agriculture that still continues to produce this export crop. And you put all that together, and this Reconstruction period is on a one-way ticket to no good place. Planter aristocracy is really, it's not what it used to be, who now take over using race appeals to win support, to keep them in political power. Now, meanwhile, you look at what's actually happening to the African American population, and it's very dismal. You don't own the land, you're working the land for somebody else, and in return for working it, you are keeping part of the crop, and you are giving the rest of the crop over to the landowner. System of bondage where you're bound by debt. You're not legally a slave, but you're not exactly free. And the net effect is you have the reconstruction of this white supremacy in the South. And this the other final kind of twist on this. Southern white legislators and planters, for the most part, they now start to enact all kinds of legislation in the South to make it very difficult to leave the South. It's not just by terror that they keep you there. They enact all kinds of legislation. They don't want to lose their labor supply. And what you see erected in the course of this 20, 30-year period, up through the 1890s to post-Reconstruction, where the North just gives up on the South, this is just the way it is. White Southern Democrats and landowners, they were very afraid briefly about a white and black class alliance of poor farmers against them. But after populism fails in 1896, white Democrats in the South try to recruit back support from poor white people by playing the so-called race card. There's also a man by the name of Booker T. Washington who delivers a famous address in the 1890s called the Atlanta Exposition Address. He opened up a school, an industrial, vocational school. And his position was black economic resources through self-help, work, saving, industry. And his message in the Atlanta Exposition Address to white Southerners is, don't go looking for immigrants, hire African Americans. Washington realizes that African Americans and white immigrants are on a trajectory where they're going to be competing for the same scraps. Then you have Frederick Douglass, a piece all about the colored one. This is a very well-constructed, logical argument, as if he's putting together a legal brief. And essentially his argument, he may say this is true, but if I find any counterexample of it, then what you are asserting is not true. So if you find a place where whites and blacks treat each other as on an equal basis, and you are claiming that that's impossible to do, then that argument is bumped. Down the list, point by point by point, where he has demolished every single argument for racial inequality in America. What's the result of this? The color line. Does racial inequality end?